Please join me in the book of Ezra, chapter number 6, verse number 14, where it says this: "And the elders of the Jews built and prospered during the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo." Now that's the Zechariah whose prophetic book we've been looking at most recently. So he and Haggai were the ones that prompted Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest and the leadership under them and the people to get back on track again during the 6th century, the later 6th century BC, in rebuilding the temple, reestablishing the Jewish faith inside the Jewish homeland, and to actually start getting Jerusalem back to normal. All this was to set the stage for the coming of the Messiah. So now we read about the finishing of that building project. It says they finished their building by decree of the God of Israel and by decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Now, we know about Cyrus. He's the one that gave the initial decree. Darius was the king who reauthorized what Cyrus had said. And then Artaxerxes, whom we will know better as Xerxes, was the one who will do the follow-up interaction with the Jewish people once they have finished the building. He will be a key player in our next story, the story of Esther. So by decree of God, by decree of the Persian kings, this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, which is the 12th month of the Jewish year, in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. And so that means that the temple construction process was actually finished in February of 515 BC. And that tells us then it was in process for about 21 years, because it's been 22 years since Cyrus gave his initial decree that it should be built. And it's about 72 years since the first temple, the Temple of Solomon, had been destroyed and Jerusalem had been destroyed. So this is a very long, drawn-out process, and we know now that all of our key players that we've spent so much time with, like Daniel and Ezekiel and others, they are long gone. So they did not get a chance to see the building of the second temple finished. But a lot of people did. So verse number 16, the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, the rest of the returned exiles, so that'd be the almost 50,000 that initially returned with Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest about 21 years ago. They've been joined over the intervening years by others who have made use of the decree of Jewish homeland reestablishment by the Persian kings. So we may have 100,000 Jews in the Promised Land by this point. We don't know for sure. And so they celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. From other passages about dedication of tabernacle and temple, we can be sure that the ceremony took place over a period of 8 days, 7 days of dedication, and then the 8th day of celebration that it's all been finished. So more than likely, we're looking at the celebration on the 8th day of dedication here. Verse 17, they offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs. That's probably sacrifices of free will, which would make them part of the big dinner and banquet celebration that would take place in conjunction with this. And so you can imagine how many people that much meat is going to feed on dedication day. And that should give you another sense of how many people are involved. Look at the lambs and the rams, for example. That's 600 total for those two types of animals. And they would typically feed at least 10 or more family units. And so already we're looking in the range of 60,000 people, adult males that may have been fed by that. And so as also a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats according to the number of the tribes of Israel. So this is a reestablishment of Israel in the land. It's not just people from the tribe of Judah and people from the tribe of Simeon and people from the tribe of Benjamin and people from the tribe of Levi. Some people kind of only focus on those tribal groups. They forget that the decree was also inviting all the ethnic Israelis from the northern kingdom that went into exile under the Assyrian kings, because where they had been relocated to has now come under the Persian Empire. And so the decree would have allowed them to return as well. And so when the sacrifice for sin at the dedication ceremony was made, all 12 tribes are represented, and therefore all 12 tribes are included in the ceremony of sin offering. Verse number 18. And they set the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their divisions for the service of God at Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. So the priests are supposed to offer the sacrifices. The Levites are supposed to do all the support ministry for the priestly work. That's from the book of Moses. But we also know from the time of David that they were put into 24 courses or divisions, 24 priestly divisions, 24 Levitical divisions, and these served 1 week at a time, 2 times every year at the temple. It was kind of a reserve unit sort of approach to ministry. The rest of the time, they would have been living in their assigned Levitical territories. But this tells us that all of that procedure was put back in place again as the temple is now up and running. Then, within the month, we are able to have our first Passover back in the finished temple. And so Ezra 6:19 says, on the 14th day of the first month, the returned exiles kept the Passover. And so the 14th of that particular year in the first month would have been about the 21st of April of 515 BC. So they are now ready to get everything back on track. Verse 20, for the priests and the Levites had purified themselves together. All of them were clean. And so they slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the returned exiles, for their fellow priests, and for themselves. So everybody that's in the land that is in reasonable health is supposed to leave wherever they live and come to Jerusalem, to the temple for Passover. So now we've got another big get-together, and this one's mandatory. The dedication ceremony would have been voluntary, but this is a mandatory get-together. Lots and lots of celebration. Verse 21, it was eaten by the people of Israel who had returned from exile, and also by everyone who had joined them and separated himself from the uncleanness of the peoples of the land to worship he who is the God of Israel. Now, I'm very intrigued by this particular note here. this tells us that besides the ethnic Israelis that are coming to worship at the temple, we have proselytes. We have Gentiles who have decided to embrace the faith of He who is as their own faith. And they are somewhere in the process of becoming Jewish, becoming part of the nation of Israel. And so they too are part of this first Passover celebration at the brand new temple, in the brand new city of Jerusalem, in the reestablished land of Judea in 515 BC. Verse number 22, they kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with joy, for He who is had made them joyful. Not a surprise. I mean, this is by now 72 years plus since the last time they were able to gather for Passover at the temple in Jerusalem. So for many of them, it's the first time ever in their life. And for the very ancient among them, they must have been kids the last time it happened, and now they are very, very old. And so joy all around. And so God had made them joyful and had turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them so that he aided them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. Now, it can be a little bit confusing here, the mention of the king of Assyria, because we've been talking about the Persian kings being involved in this process. Well, you just need to take into consideration that when the Persian Empire enveloped a region that was already governed, such as the Assyrian Empire, the Persian king just took on that title as well. So the Persian king was the king of Assyria, and the Persian king was the king of Babylon. It just became one of his many titles. Then at this point, I think we need to go to Ezra chapter 4. We've seen how everything has been reestablished, and everything looks really happy, and everything is looking good. And we might be tempted to think that everything will be fine from here on out, but it's not. Because in Ezra chapter 4, verse number 6, it says that in the reign of Ahasuerus, that's Xerxes, in the beginning of his reign, and he began reigning at the death of his father, I think it's 486 BC. I believe that's correct. Let me check my notes real quick. 486, 485, somewhere in that neighborhood. When he had just come to the throne, this is what happened. They, and the they here means the enemies of the Jewish people, the people living in the regions nearby, like up in Samaria, and down to the south in the Arab territories, things like that. So these people that don't like the Jewish people coming back to their homeland, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. So they start bringing legal action in the courts of Persia to hassle the growth of the Jewish presence in their homeland. And this is more than likely the reason why that Mordecai, in the next story that we're going to transition to, tells his ward, Esther, to not reveal her ethnicity as a Jew. Because he, working in the palace, working in the administration of King Xerxes, understands that there are some serious anti-Semites out there working against the Jewish people trying to hassle them. I mean, that's part of the reason for the delay of the rebuilding of the temple. And it's getting worse. In fact, there are some of them, and a key person will be the villain in the story of Esther, would like to see all ethnic Israelis in the Persian Empire annihilated. And so that's a good reason for Esther to keep her background quiet. All right, so that gives us the background to move to our next book, which is the book of Esther. And chapter number 1 sets the stage talking about Xerxes the First. Now, it uses another name for him, but that's not a problem for us because we know historically that it is the same person that we know of as Xerxes the First. Now, in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India, not the country, but the subcontinent region, more than likely we're talking about the area of Afghanistan, somewhere in that region, maybe western India. So he reigned from India to Ethiopia. So that's down south of Egypt. So the Persian Empire under Xerxes, when he first came to power, stretched from India through the upper Middle East of what is sometimes referred to as Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. So we're talking about Iran, Iraq, Armenia, Syria, and then down into the lower Middle East. So now we're talking about the Promised Land area, which is today modern-day Saudi Arabia and Lebanon and Israel and the Palestinian Authority territories, and then all the way down into modern-day Egypt and clear down to modern-day Ethiopia. But it wasn't just that big crescent between the Nile and the two rivers and then the rivers of India. We're also seeing that the Persian Empire had control of what is referred to as Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. So they went all the way out to the Aegean Sea. In fact, the king before Xerxes, his father, Darius, had been gearing up to overtake the Greek homelands. He wanted to push the Persian Empire even into Europe. And so now that he has died, his son comes to power, and he wants to fulfill that dream of his father. Verse number 2, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the capital, and that's in the western end of modern-day Iran. In the 3rd year of his reign, which I believe is 483 BC. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and the governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and the pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. Now, what's he doing here? He's basically trying to pump up support for himself as his father's son. Now, there were some disputes to his right to the throne within the family, and you can go and check on that historically. But what he really needs is everybody to trust him in pursuing his father's dream of attacking, invading, and conquering the Greek homelands. That's going to take a lot of convincing. So he throws this 180-day feast for his leadership. Verse number 5, when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So as the wrap-up, he throws one more 7-day big blowout extravaganda in the city of Susa, so that the people living there will be impressed. And they ought to be. I mean, look at the description of the banqueting facilities here. They dressed it up really big time. Verse 6, there were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. I mean, that would be an amazing place to banquet for 7 days. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. Remember, he governs a huge portion of the ancient eastern end of the Mediterranean basin. And so they've got vintages of all sorts that he can bring here, and food of all sorts that he can bring here and impress these people with. Verse 8, the drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Now, what does that mean? I think it has this idea that everybody has the opportunity to participate in the consumption of any of the vintages. It's not going to be limited to only select few. It's whatever is there, you can order and test it. And so it could be like a gigantic wine tasting week for many of these people. And for a lot of them, they've never been involved in anything like this before, and very likely they'll never have the chance again. So this is amazing extravagance. And it's not just Xerxes that is throwing a party. Verse number 9, Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. So we seem to have gender separation that's happening here in this culture. And so while all the men are gathering with the king and talking about the future, talking about the power of the Persian Empire and how Greeks should just roll over and let them control their area of the world as well. All the ladies are gathering with the primary wife, the primary power broker of the women of this empire, in another part of the palace. Queen Vashti was probably a princess, and when she came to be the wife of the prince of Persia, she wasn't just a pretty face. She wasn't just the daughter of a different potentate. She was a power player of her own. And she had wisdom and prestige and persuasiveness. And so her job, if you will, is to convince the ladies of the kingdom it will be worth it for us to send our husbands and our sons and our brothers off to war, because the empire needs to come first. It needs to expand. And so that's what you need to understand in order to appreciate the next part of the story, which with only a couple of minutes left, we're not going to get very far into it. So verse number 10, on the 7th day, so we're about to wrap everything up, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. So because he knows everything is wrapping up, he's a little bit more free in his drinking. He commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zetar, and Karkas, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. So these men that are mentioned here, they're not slaves. They are highly placed officials in the kingdom of Persia. They have sacrificed their own genetic future in order to serve in these positions. That's why they are eunuchs. They are not looking to their own family. They are looking to the family of the king. And so they are taking care of things at the palace. If you want to think of them as anything, think of them as both government officials and secret service. That's probably a mixture of their job. And so they are directed by King Xerxes, Ahasuerus, bring Queen Vashti here, escort her here into this group that has gathered. And then the trouble comes. Verse 12. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. And at this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. So she does not appreciate being treated like a slave, like a piece of meat, like a servant to be ordered around, because she is the queen. She is the most powerful female in the kingdom, and much more powerful than the majority of officials that might be sitting with the king right now.